Hi, everyone. Welcome to another of our Data Insights webinars. My name is Fran Faircloth. I'm a partner at Ropes and Gray in our Data Privacy and Cybersecurity group. And this series, the Data Insights series, focuses on data and data analytics and the intersection of those things to law, policy, and business. We have a really great presentation today. It's the third in our series for this year. And we have another presentation coming up later in November that you'll hear more about if you stay tuned to the end of this webinar. But for now, let me hand it over to Bill Gunther, who's going to kick us off with a little more background on today's panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Fran. I'm Bill Gunther. I'm president of Mass Insight, and we are incredibly pleased to continue to partner with Ropes and Gray and Northeastern's DeMoore McKim School of Business in this Data Insights webinar series. In the era of AI and the access to vast new data sets, there's no more timely topic than looking at RWE, or real world evidence, and the role that it can play in accelerating drug development. Our partner at Ropes and Gray today to moderate and introduce the panel is Kelly Combs, and I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Bill and Fran, and welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel today about real-world evidence. In recent years, pharmaceutical and biotech companies have increasingly incorporated real-world evidence into product development programs. And this evolution has been spurred by greater access to real-world evidence, legislative changes, and significant policy development by FDA and by other regulators. The use of real-world evidence, as we'll discuss today, raises some really novel opportunities, as well as new challenges for regulators and the industry on the whole. During today's discussion, we'll start by doing some level setting to make sure everyone understands what we mean when we talk about real-world evidence. Then we'll go on to discuss the current landscape for RWE with a focus on FDA developments as well as industry trends. We'll talk about various considerations for using real-world evidence. In particular, how do you ensure that the evidence is reliable and relevant and otherwise fit for purpose? And then we'll close out with a discussion about some future opportunities as well as what's on the horizon. Joining me today are true experts in their field, starting off with Dr. Chris Boone. Dr. Boone serves as the Vice President, Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at AbbVie. He is also an adjunct assistant professor of health administration at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and an active board member of several influential organizations. Prior to AbbVie, he served in two different roles at Pfizer as the VP and head of global medical epidemiology and big data analysis, and the VP and global head of real world data and analytics. Thanks, Chris, for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Justin Mangiarides, who is an associate professor of biostatistics in the Department of Health Sciences and directs the Masters of Science program in real-world evidence at Northeastern University. He received his PhD in biostatistics from Harvard University and completed postdoctoral training at the Harvard School of Public Health. In addition to his role as a curriculum lead for the OHDSI Center at the Roux Institute, Professor Mangiarides is currently working across several NIH, EPA, and CDC-funded grants involving research ranging from estimating health effects of environmental exposures to the design and analysis of clinical trials to improve sleep apnea outcomes. Thanks, Justin. And then finally, we have Lauren Silvas. Lauren is the Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Tempus, overseeing regulatory, public policy, and government affairs. Lauren has held a number of senior career public health roles, serving as Senior Advisor at the Department of Health and Human Services, Chief of Staff for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and Deputy Center Director for Policy and FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. During her time in government, Lauren advanced policies to promote innovation in precision medicine, real-world evidence, clinical trials, and digital health. So we're thrilled to have such an outstanding panel today. And as I mentioned at the outset, we're going to begin this afternoon with some level setting about real-world evidence. So Justin, I'd like to start with you, and let's talk about some of the basics. can you describe real-world evidence and give us some examples of common data sources, please?
Yes, Kelly, and thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about this topic, which is really interesting and driving a lot of my research right now. So yes, just to level set, we'll talk about two different terms, and I'm going to give definitions because these are FDA-defined terms. And these definitions were established by the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act in 2007. So the first definition is real-world data, RWD. And these are data that are relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare from routinely collected data from a variety of sources. So these are data that are not collected in, say, a clinical trial. Some of the common sources where we find real-world data are electronic health records, insurance claims and billing records, product and disease registries. We have a lot of patient-generated real-world data from wearables and mobiles and cell phones, patient-reported outcomes when people visit a doctor and fill out forms about just their current health status. And then there are certain government sources for data like behavioral risk factor surveillance systems and vitals registries, and Medicare data are considered real-world data. And so it's really data that's collected for purposes other than a predefined study or a clinical trial. Now, when we use this data in an analysis, we use it to generate real-world evidence. So real-world evidence is the evidence regarding usage, potential benefits, risks for medical products, treatments, biologics that are derived from real-world data. So a lot of real-world evidence we think about from like a post-marketing surveillance, looking at adverse outcomes of treatments once they are in a wider population. But they're really, real-world evidence is used across the entire drug development pipeline from R&D through that post-marketing surveillance period. And so real-world evidence has been used for identifying extended indications for drugs, so off-label or secondary uses for drugs that have already been approved. They're used to supplement current or future clinical trials by finding external control arms, so adding additional patients through using this data. And a lot of it is what we consider observational research. It's research that does not involve the researcher assigning a treatment to one individual or another. So it's we're just taking this data, we call it secondary use data maybe, and we're seeing kind of what we can get out of this data that is collected outside of clinical trials, outside of a study environment. So it's really what happens to people in the real world, how they're actually using treatments, how treatments are actually being administered.
And thanks for that, Justin. So, I mean, you do tee up the concept that real world evidence is different from clinical trials. You know, we're talking about actual use settings. Are there other key distinctions from clinical trials that we should be aware of when we're talking about real world evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. So randomized clinical trials are the gold standard for generating clinical evidence. They're highly regulated. They're very well specified, and the reason is we want to try and get at causality. You know, we want to figure out what happens to a patient on drug A versus drug B, or what happens to a population if we change a treatment protocol. And the way we study these questions with a randomized control trial, you know, the randomized part is really, it's crucial, and the researcher is assigning a treatment. And the way that treatment is assigned is by randomizing our subjects to one of, you know, however many treatment arms we might have. We might have a treatment and a placebo, so we have two treatment arms, or we might have, we're studying the effects of different dosages, and we might have 5 different treatment arms. But the key is that subjects come in and they are randomized to one of those treatment arms. So there's no control over what treatment subject is receiving. And we do this to try and balance out additional factors, risk factors that might influence the outcome in a patient. So in other words, if we wanted to conduct a randomized control trial for like a watch and wait strategy for prostate cancer, we might assign 100 patients to standard treatment or a procedure, and we might assign 100 patients to a watch and wait strategy. We wouldn't want to have all 100 of our patients in a watch and wait strategy to be smokers and all 100 in the other arm to be non-smokers. So we have this randomization piece that we hope to balance out these external factors, and there could be all sorts of factors like age, sex, alcohol consumption, income. There's so many of these external factors, and we rely on that randomization piece to sort of balance out those other factors between our treatment arms so we can get a common comparison. And when we do this, we're also doing these studies in like highly controlled environments. So if we're thinking about a new drug or drug A versus a drug B, we're doing these in environments where we know that patients are maybe receiving the treatment that we assign them to. We think they are. They're adhering to their treatment. They're not being assigned to treatment A and then going and taking treatment B or going and taking a placebo. We have this sort of knowledge of what's actually happening to our subjects. But it comes at a little bit of a cost when we do these randomized control trials. We can't often include a very broad patient population, as broad as we would like. For instance, randomized control trials almost always are going to exclude children, they're going to exclude adolescents, they're going to exclude usually pregnant or lactating people, and often people with chronic conditions. So if you're doing a randomized control trial for a new blood pressure medication, you're not going to probably be enrolling a lot of people who are dealing with a chronic cancer. So we're restricted in sort of the generalizability often of our results because we're doing it in a highly selected population, and often on a very pre-specified timeline. So it might be a short timeline, a couple months, maybe a couple of years, but usually it's on a shorter timeline. With real-world evidence, we are using these large data sets like EHRs and claims, and we're able to sort of see a much more general population, sometimes across multiple countries, across different healthcare systems, sometimes even across different time periods, depending on how you're designing your study. And you can sort of replicate a trial within this observational data, and you're not bound by some of these inclusion, exclusion restraints and restrictions in order to still conduct a study at the sort of expense of not being able to randomize that treatment. And that's what we sort of are constantly developing statistical methods for, and always working towards sort of how do we overcome this issue and real world evidence of not having control over that randomization of the treatment, not having control over, knowing the adherence to a treatment or a medication. But we sort of chalk this up and say, this is what's actually happening in the real world. Just because somebody is prescribed a blood pressure medication does not mean that they're going to take that full course. Or same thing with an antibiotic, all these different issues that we can't control in the real world. So in some sense, they do give us real world evidence studies give us a really good picture of what happens in real life over a longer time period. We can just keep collecting data for as long as we'd like. But we don't have control over that randomization piece, which is really important, or really like a strong real knowledge of things like adherence to treatment protocols.
Got it. Thanks, Justin, for that great explanation. So, Chris, I want to turn to you. Obviously, there's been a pretty significant uptick of real-world evidence in recent years, but I'd love to hear from you about how our thinking about real-world evidence and its application has changed over time.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kelly. I think, can you hear me okay? All right, good. Well, first of all, I want to say that, there's been a significant evolution of how we utilize and how we think about RWE over the years. I mean, most people think that it's a relatively new term, and I think in most part it is, but it was conceptualized in around 2007, 2008 by ISPOR. And if you think about that time period, we're talking about the last 15 years, what you've seen is several dynamics happen, whether you see sort of an evolution or the maturation of public policy as it serves as a catalyst for expanded use of RWE. You see, a ubiquitous amount or adoption of EHRs and these very innovative digital technologies that have come out that generate novel data that we've never quite seen before. So what it has allowed us to do is shift our thinking from just thinking of RWE as primarily used, to Justin's point, as more of a post-marketing surveillance utility for safety, in the sort of the post-Vioxx era, to one where we're now thinking about how do we effectively track and understand disease burden, disease characterization, and ultimately the sort of treatment effects or the effectiveness of these different therapies in a real world context that's not controlled and hopefully is diverse by all the factors that Justin just mentioned. And I think that, once we take an example like COVID, for example, what became glaringly apparent that, was like the worst kept secret ever is that health equity is a real issue in the US. Right. And we saw that through mortality. We saw that through treatment and access and all these things. And so, of course, it brings to the forefront what digital technologies, what data are we using to better understand that, to manage it, and hopefully improve it through policy, through clinical treatment guidelines, through how we engage many of these patients in sort of more of a patient-centric model. So I think that there's been several dynamics that have happened, everything from public policy, and we recently got guidance from the FDA about how we should be thinking about RWE I'm continuously seeing new technologies, new data sources being created, and now they're getting even more focused on sort of specific rare diseases, which I think is fascinating, right? Because we're learning more about these rare diseases than we ever knew, and there's well over 10,000 in this space. And of course, as the world continues to demand, I think more personalized care. So what works for you, Kelly, may not work for me. I want to be able, as a patient, advocate for myself to demand that I get the care and the treatments that work for me specifically and not for the average. So I think that just a shift in thinking from the consumers, a shift in thinking from the consumers and patients, a shift in thinking from the policymakers and how they even develop public policy as it pertains to our overall healthcare system, a shift in thinking from pharma as we focus on disrupting ourselves and how we think about clinical trials and how we develop and commercialize drugs, and a shift in thinking from caregivers and providers as they sort of move and shift even more closely to a much more evidence-based care delivery system that we all desire. And I think that is what I've seen. I'll sort of end with this. I've been around this long enough to know when they call it voodoo science, and so to see that we are where we are now and there's a demand for it, I'm here for it. So, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. There's certainly been a really impressive and significant evolution just in the last few years. Before we close out our introductory section about real world evidence, can you give us a sense of whether there are any common misconceptions about real world evidence that you think would be helpful to address before we get into the meatier part of the discussion?
Oh gosh, there's several. I mean, one thing I would quickly point out is, a point Justin made in his opening remarks is it's not just about post-marketing surveillance. That should be point number one. So it's bigger than just tracking a safety surveillance tool, if you will. I think the other thing that I would point out is that the misconception is that RCTs or RWE is somehow inferior to RCTs, and they sort of try to pit one against the other. And in many respects, they're complementary. I mean, I think that they're complementary evidentiary sources that both should be used if and where appropriate. In some cases, you'll find RCT is better. In some cases, you'll find an RWE study is better. As Justin mentioned, RCTs, very controlled environment, homogeneous patient population, not generalizable because it's not reflective of the real world. RWE, you get a much more diverse population. It's a real world setting. It's reflecting how the caregivers are actually engaging with many of the patients. I think those things are important. I think the other thing, sort of building on that last point, the real world and how caregivers are engaging with the patient, I think some people would say that makes the RWE unreliable, right? Because, if you start to look at one provider versus the next, even within the same healthcare system, they could actually be utilizing different clinical pathways to treat a patient. And of course, sort of their prerogative, right? If they haven't standardized that. And so in a more of an RCT, all of that is standardized and it's controlled. And so I think it does create some challenges there. And I think one of the things that I've been fighting against for a number of years is certainly, the regulators don't care about it. There's a lack of sort of regulatory acceptance, I guess we'll call it, right? And honestly, I've seen the opposite of that. I've seen more regulators around the world be more interested in how they can better utilize RWE in there. They're looking for manufacturers to sort of propose studies that they can think about and that they can sort of support. And so I think that, those are some long-standing, misguided misconceptions that have been out there. And I think that we should address those.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that provides a brilliant segue to Lauren to talk about the current landscape for real world evidence. Chris had mentioned the notion of regulatory acceptance, and I know that there have been a number of legal and regulatory and policy developments, even in recent years, that have significantly impacted the way that real world evidence is being used. So, Lauren, how did we get here?
Well, I think that Chris and Justin did a great job of framing the issue, telling the story, and explaining, why it's important and so relevant today. I think that, they both mentioned that this is a larger policy issue, and I do think that's the right way to think about it. Like, you can sort of get in the weeds of FDA web pages and look at it as a program. And I think it really is instead an evolution of FDA's approach to looking more broadly at data sources and types of evidence to inform their decision making. It's sort of, I also think Chris did a great job of sort of saying this was happening a long time ago, right? So think about what was happening. FDA had all these rules around one type of data source, clinical trials and all the regs and all the guidances about how to conduct these rigorous clinical trials. But then there were all these other collections of data happening out there in the real world that reflected something different in a subpopulation or, broaden an indication, sort of looking more broadly at who hadn't been studied. And so, FDA was already sort of looking at policy in this area before the moment in 21st Century Cures, the legislation that directed FDA to establish a framework for real world evidence. But, FDA had already seen there were certain advantages in dealing with real world evidence in terms of the sometimes longitudinal nature that really couldn't be captured in a clinical trial for approval. Different endpoints that are, better designed because they're from the real world. Definitely subpopulations and diversity and sort of, both clinically and genomically defined subpopulations that, may come to light as a product is used more broadly. And so the centers were already thinking about this. I started in the device center and then was in the commissioner's office. And so, yes, they were directed to establish a framework, and now there is a more formal program. And we've seen a series of guidance on exactly the issues that Justin and Chris teed up, how to think about registries, claims and EHR data, external comparators, how to develop them. But I think, sort of what's happening and what's coming, what I, think we should all keep in mind and focus on and try to push forward on policy development is the use of RWE sort of more broadly across, FDA's other policy areas. For example, in its development of policies regarding the use of artificial intelligence, which is largely going to be based on RWE because it'll be, based on retrospective data initially, and then accelerated approval is another one. We have these other programs where we need to think about how does RWE become part and parcel of all of the ways that we think about medical product development, really. So, when I think about the guidances, I think not just about the ones that have RWE in the title, but the guidances across other program areas that recognize RWE as a source of data that can help, FDA and sponsors get to where we need to be in terms of, bringing products to patients that are not only, going through what we consider the more traditional FDA route, but addressing some of the larger societal issues because they can incorporate RWE, in the regulatory process.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And I want to keep going on that same point. Are there any FDA approval decisions incorporating RWE that you think are notable or interesting in some way? Any trends?
I think it's important to keep up the steady cadence of FDA looking at RWE across product areas. Oncology Center of Excellence has done a really good job in terms of issuing policies, explicitly recognizing RWE and talking about it, and some external collaborations and partnerships. And I know that other therapeutic areas within FDA are looking at it. The ProGraph approval for organ transplant was one where there was historical control data that was, real world evidence. It's really nice to see that it's not just happening in oncology. Certainly rare disease, with natural history studies being an important source for those disease areas. We see that, but I think I'm never looking for this watershed moment, FDA did it and relied on RWE. I'm more looking at, is it part and parcel of the conversations we're having when you were going in for a pre-IND, as your IND meetings? Are you talking about ways that RWE can inform your clinical trial design, your patient, your selection, what subpopulations you're looking at, how you can use it as supplemental to the package if it's not the determinative factor, but really help FDA understand the benefit risk analysis of your drug. And so, that's when I look at approvals, I think about is it happening in the day-to-day conversations as part of everything that FDA is doing when it's thinking about its job.
Thanks, Lauren. I think you did a nice job of describing some of the developments and then also some of the practical considerations for sponsors to keep in mind. Justin, I want to turn to you for a moment. Lauren gave us a nice overview of some of the regulatory history, but are there other historical use cases that you think are worth discussing?
Yeah, and there are certain ones that I like to present in classes or in talks to just sort of level set of here's some interesting times real world evidence has had big impact in healthcare. More recently, I think the paper that Pfizer put out probably 2 years ago now, where they looked at the immune response of the third COVID booster in Israel, and it was sort of that was a great example of using real world data to help us inform timing of the third COVID booster dose. So I think that was a really great paper, both for using to sort of teach people about real world evidence in a real understandable, real impactful way, but also historically in 2019, there was I believe this was also Pfizer, had Ibrance was a treatment for breast cancer. The clinical trial that was conducted excluded men, and then it was an approved treatment, and then off-label use of Ibrance for men led to an FDA approval for the use of Ibrance for men with breast cancer. I think that's a really interesting. It sort of combines all these things. We talk about the RCT, this wonderful thing that led to the FDA approval for this treatment, but the restriction around the populations that were involved, how can we generalize it? And then using RWE to supplement that is a really nice example, I think.
Thanks, Justin. So now we've had a chance to talk about the evolution of RWE and to talk about some specific examples. Now that it seems regulators have increasing comfort with the use of RWE, I'd be interested to know about industry trends or recent collaborations of interest. Chris, do you have any ideas on this front?
Sure. It's interesting. I saw a recent stat that said that 85% of industry sponsors are engaged in one or more sort of innovative partnerships with either a digital company or a data company or both, right? So I think that there's quite a significant amount of activity that's been happening in this space for a while. I mean, several years ago, you saw the announcement of GSK and its partnership with 23andMe. I think that sort of highlights this one of the emerging trends that I think you should pay attention to, which is the sort of direct to consumer genetic testing. One of the things that we focused on a lot when it comes to EHR, sort of RWE or RWD over the last several years has been our claims data has been our EHR data, because those have been the most reliable data sources. But I think now you're seeing a greater interest in incorporating the environmental data that we got, many of the open data sources that sort of give a better sort of perspective on many of the social determinants. You've also seen a greater interest in the incorporation of genetic and genomic data for the patient and sort of analyzing all of these different data sources to get a better picture of the patient. You've seen a greater interest in developing sort of digital therapeutics, and many pharma companies shifting their mindset to that we develop therapeutics, whether they be medicinal or digital sort of thing, and trying to figure that piece out. I think that, as Lauren mentioned, the AI piece is significant, and it should never go understated, because I can't even say we really even scratched the surface of it yet. And that sort of creates a whole host of issues, both policy, ethical, and technological, that we should all consider, or legal, even if you want to go that route. I think that we've also been toying a lot with how to better utilize and incorporate data that we get from many of the health trackers that are out there, the wearables, the sensors. We have this issue around sort of patient consent and patient sort of contribution, if you will. We all have the ability to sort of capture and collect our data on our mobile devices through HealthKit now, or whatever you use, Google, whatever. But you also have the ability to now share that data too. So that's a very powerful sort of engagement of the patients directly into to actual study design and the science of it all. I think another thing, which sort of leads me to my last point around patient centricity or patient empowerment and patient design. I've seen just so much happening with patient groups that are wanting to be more involved in the design of many of these studies that that are sort of focused on the diseases of interest to them. I think that sponsors and manufacturers have always tried to figure out the best way to partner in that regard, and while keeping the appropriate safeguards in place. I think you'll continue to see novel ways of how to better sort of partner with the patient community to sort of create studies that more reflect their preferences in many respects, their needs, and also have the ability to capture their experiences through patient-reported outcomes and other modalities such as that. So I think that's the big thing. I mean, I think we saw a big splash several years ago, the whole Roche and Flatiron thing, and then the Foundation Medicine, and then the GSK and all these other people. And I just happened to be at Pfizer at the time, and I know we were exploring different things as well. But I think that now, you're seeing a shift that some pharma companies feel, a lot of them feel that, hey, that may not be our wheelhouse, that may not be our core competency. So we were looking for more strategic, long-term strategic collaborations. And I think that's going to be sort of the key to success.
Thanks, Chris. And Lauren, I'd love to hear from you. What are you seeing in terms of interesting trends or strategic collaborations that are worth discussing?
So on the strategic collaborations front, I mean, I do think it's a tremendous opportunity to use real world data and real world evidence throughout the product lifecycle, from early feasibility studies to, post-market. I mean, and so that's where we're seeing a tremendous value in the use of data, because you can really understand disease area, other products, subpopulations, targets, and really look at probability of technical and regulatory success through real world data, and then, use it to inform new indications. So if you take a long-term view, these partnerships, I think we're seeing, tremendous potential and a lot of value in. I also think that, one of the really interesting things, like we've already said a lot of words about the different sources of data, right? Registries and EHR, and there's proprietary EHRs, and there's, curated data, and there's multimodal data. And so, I also think it's worthwhile keeping an eye on sort of, third-party run projects looking at sources of real-world evidence, because we have Duke Margolis, we have Reagan-Udall, we have Friends of Cancer Research that are taking data from different sources and trying to, look at it together to understand what we can learn, and, recognizing that different data sources have different, strengths and may be better situated to answer a certain question. But NFDA is doing that too, right? They have out research proposals, and they're saying we're looking for real-world data to, so we can have a better understanding of, and they have, lists of questions that they, want to collaborate with. And so I think that the more that data is out there, not necessarily for a specific regulatory purpose and a specific product, but also to just like inform the understanding of the data itself, and, the field, or the way that data can be used in a certain disease or therapeutic area, I think is also, worth keeping an eye on, because that also helps like the overall acceptability and understanding of what real world data can do.
Thanks, Lauren. And so now that we've laid the groundwork with respect to RWE and have talked about, some recent developments, industry trends, and so on, let's now move on to a discussion about how sponsors can actually leverage real-world evidence, for purposes of regulatory submission or for other reasons. Talking about concepts like ensuring relevance and reliability, thinking about questions related to fit for purpose, and so on. So I want to talk about first some common challenges with real-world evidence, and let's start with you, Justin.
Sure. So I already mentioned before, this lack of randomization when we're talking about doing these analyses, and we sort of have to develop methods to handle that. But I think more generally, those are problems in analyses that go beyond real-world evidence. So when I think of real-world data and real-world evidence, something that I think is a challenge is maybe a bit of a mindset that just because we have these enormous data sets that are capturing, millions, billions of patient lives, that that this is like just as good as, or it's like this ultra random sample. The big data doesn't necessarily mean it's a random sample, and big data might be more precision, but it doesn't mean you're precise around the right answer. And so, as Chris mentioned earlier, when we think about how different subgroups, patient populations might not be represented in data, or might not be having a response to a treatment that is average to what the data set predicted. And so I think we have to kind of think a little bit more about the data sets that we're using and who's being captured in those data sets. For instance, if you are using EHR systems from academic healthcare centers, you're getting a very different patient population than if you're looking at insurance and billing claims from community healthcare centers. We're, in some work that I'm looking at now, we're looking at patient-reported outcomes, and we're getting very different inclusion in these large data sets, depending on whether the patient, is a native English speaker or not. It's sort of like whether they're getting the appropriate form to fill out. Are they even included in this data set? And we're, any sort of bias that happens at the data collection stage is just going to sort of perpetuate through the whole process. And then other issues that I think we're certainly the groups that I work with at Northeastern and our Odyssey Center, and is around reproducibility of results. How do we ensure that the clinical trials are so well sort of regulated and documented, and there's best practices, and when we look at certain studies that are conducted using real world data and real world evidence studies, how do we ensure that a lot of those study protocols were sort of established beforehand, that the outcomes were defined beforehand, that if I conduct the same study in my EHR system, I'll get the same answer as you. And so we really want to look into like, how can we systematize the process of generating reliable evidence from real world data. And then the last thing, which is just sort of a little point that I always like to talk about, is the adoption of real world data has been very rapid, I think, and across like the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry. And I think for academics, we're a little behind. And I think, one of those reasons is a lot of these really exciting data assets are just so expensive, and we can't necessarily in academia, afford or, reasonably pay for licenses to some of these enormous and exciting data assets. And I look, I would love to see more real world evidence. I know we talk a lot about clinical studies and we talk about regulatory sciences. From my background, I would love to see more real world data and real world evidence being used more in a public health setting, and just looking at common public health literature and journals. People are using real world data sources, even though they might not have been called real world data sources, things like the Medicare data and things like, disease registries. But we're not seeing the adoption of these, multi system EHRs, things like, Market Scan and Optum Health, or, all these really exciting new, like giant real world data, real world evidence assets. And I think that's some place that we as academics have, are hopefully going soon. And if we can just kind of overcome that barrier to entry.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Justin. Really interesting point. Not something that we're commonly thinking of in industry as how to leverage the knowledge from academia as well. Chris, I want to turn to you. Are there other challenges or concerns associated with use of RWE that we should talk about?
It's interesting. I was listening to Justin and he made me think that there is this whole issue of the lack of access to data for academia is huge. Why? Because it affects the talent pipeline. Right. So his issues that he's describing are upstream, my issues are downstream. Right. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that you see affecting the ability for many of these sort of manufacturers or sponsors to build these capabilities within their companies is a lack of talent, a lack of expertise. And so they're as they strive to build out more RWE capabilities, they're limited, they're hamstrung, just because there's just not the in-house expertise they need, which goes back to Justin and his university of having one of the only master's programs in RWE in the country. I think that's fascinating and it's pioneering from them, but we do need to see it replicated more across the country to increase the pipeline. That's one thing that I'll point out. The other thing that I think Justin hit on too that's important is around this issue of data quality and standardization. I think it's huge, right? I mean, it's not uncommon for me to get a data provider that says, hey, we have 250,000 patients with this particular disease. And then when we get into it, we could probably only use 1,000 or 5,000 of those patient totals. And it's mostly because the data itself is not, it's not, we'll say, regulatory or RWE grade, if you will, regulatory grade RWE for what we're trying to do. So I think there's also an issue, and I alluded to this earlier, around sort of temporal variability, meaning that over time you'll see the standard of care, the treatment patterns evolve as we learn more. But unfortunately, when it comes to sort of replicating or reproducing those studies, you have to go back to that point in time and follow the guidelines or the protocol that was being used by the caregiver at that time. Otherwise, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? So that's something that we have to think about as we sort of track trends over time. And then I think lastly, the point that I would say is this issue around bias. One of the greatest criticisms I've heard personally directly is around cherry picking patients to get favorable outcomes or favorable results for any sort of decision, whether it be from a regulatory decision or payer negotiations or what have you. And so that addressing this issue around selection bias, measurement bias, confounding bias, are all very important sort of challenges to overcome as we think about expanded use of RWE.
Great, thanks, Chris. And Justin, I want to come back to you. You know, I know from chatting with you beforehand and looking at your bio that you might be able to share with us some information about new statistical methodologies or modeling techniques or other methods that are specifically being developed for the use of RWE.
Yeah, so I think there's there is a lot of interest in this area, and there's some really interesting sort of academic industry partnerships and groups and communities that get together and do these types of projects. One that came out of, I believe, the Cures Act is the Odyssey community that established the common data model, the OMOP common data model, and there's a lot of people in that group that are working on all sorts of problems, like, for instance, to address the confounding issues. You know, we've traditionally, and sort of way back when, we used to do these propensity score analyses, which would sort of establish what's the probability that somebody would be assigned to treatment or not in an observational data set. So we try to get around that randomization piece, or replicate that randomization piece of in a clinical trial by sort of looking at what's the likelihood that this person who is on treatment would have been, not on treatment. And so there's lots of work now being done now that we have these EHRs and so much data on people, and combining these on ultra high dimensional propensity scores, and then being able to sort of take as Chris mentioned, huge amounts of people, and narrow our study down to the 2,500 that most replicate a randomized control trial. And I think that's really exciting work, where you're sort of combining a lot of methods of old school propensity score methods and old school methods around figuring out equipoise, but then taking advantage of the massive amounts of data we can have. And also there's a lot of work now being done in how do we efficiently work in sort of federated data environments. So how can we get groups together that have multiple data sets, data assets, and do an analysis sort of across all of these data sets, combine the results in a way that is done at scale and replicable and systematized. But, if I'm working with another data partner, I never actually have to see their data, and they don't have to see the data of the other data partners, and sort of these federated data analyses that can be done in a very efficient way, and can generally, if done correctly, and perform better than the traditional style of doing a meta-analysis, which is taking a bunch of results from separate studies and combining them. We sort of do one giant study that nobody looks at anybody's data. And I think that's sort of really, really interesting new methods, and a lot of really great work being done by causal inference groups. Hernan and Robbins sort of had a really important paper about how do we use big data, big observational study. They didn't, I think, use the word real world data, but they just talked about large observational studies to emulate a target trial. So in other words, you do a randomized control trial, you end up doing the trial that you could do, based on your inclusion, exclusion, what's the actual target trial? What did you set out to try to do? Let's take that as the starting point, and how do we replicate and emulate that using sort of a real world data asset? And there's a lot of work being done around that. That's really exciting, I think.
Thanks, Justin. So turning now to the topic of health equity. So we've touched on this a few times already during our session, and it sounds like, so far from the discussion, that there might be real shortfalls when it comes to real world evidence and its current ability to address health equity concerns, but also some real opportunities to consider. So Chris, I'd love to hear from you about how the use of real world evidence can address health equity and what stakeholders should be thinking about in this respect.
Well, yeah, I think we have touched on it in one way or another in different parts of this conversation, but I think that obviously it's the attainment of diverse patient populations is certainly one of the key drivers for it. I think the ability to identify disparities or inequities in the system, as highlighted by the COVID example that I provided earlier, is one of the key things. And then I think ultimately informing policy and decision making, and that policy is not just at the federal level, but it could be at the local and state levels as well. You have some states who are making Medicaid decisions, and usually it's not based on clear evidence. I think RWE can play a very pivotal role in sort of guiding some of those policymakers and making it just more informed. They may end up in the same place, but at least it's a data-driven decision and not an instinctive decision, as they say. But I think just some key considerations for stakeholders to keep in mind is that inclusive data collection is important. We quickly sort of pivot to EHR data in many cases, and I always tell people that there is a forgotten population of folks that exist in this country and around the world who are not actually even going to the doc, but even if they do, they may not have those robust EHR capabilities to sort of get an accurate depiction of that disease or those populations in through those platforms. The other thing is that designing studies and this goes back to a point that Justin raised earlier, as far as considering demographic factors as part of your study design and being able to stratify against those factors, I think is important. One of the things that we've learned and we've actively engaged as part of this too is the engagement of the community. In many of our studies, we engage with community leaders and patient groups to sort of inform and guide our thinking around many of the studies, which I think is important as you think about RWE and inclusion. The other piece is that in HEOR specifically, at least the function within AbbVie, we sort of comprise a highly multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary function, meaning that we have folks that represent all sorts of, whether they are clinicians, whether they're pharmacists, whether they are health services researchers, data scientists, epidemiologists, you name it. We're all sort of housed in this one group. And the beautiful thing about it is that it creates a very, I think you get broad sort of understanding of an issue because you're seeing it from so many different perspectives, right? And in addition to that, we also have diverse talent, and diversity in every sort of dimension that you could think of is sort of reflected in as we think about the challenges to meet there. I think the data privacy and ethics piece is important. We always strive to do consent-based studies where we're engaging the patient, and then we also try to be. And in order for us to do that, we have to be highly transparent about our intentions, our design, what we do with the data, so on and so forth, and all those things are important. And then just routinely monitoring progress, right? And tracking, and not treating it as a one-time study, but really sort of tracking progress over time is important.
Thanks, Chris. And Lauren, I want to come back to you. We've talked about kind of various issues to consider when leveraging RWE, and we touched on the topic of interesting collaborations. How should parties be approaching these sorts of collaborations, and what are the key issues that you think parties need to be keeping in mind?
Well, I think a lot of the themes that we've talked about are ones that you need to put forefront of the sort of list of issues that you work through in a collaboration. And data rights like access and privacy, and how that is transferred from the place at which the health information is collected to an entity that may not be directly part of the patient encounter, but wants to use it as part of a study or a submission, and how that works, and how the privacy overlay, which HIPAA does facilitate research based on de-identified data in order can be used to improve health outcomes for patients. You need to think through those things and how you can sort of transfer the data throughout. And I think also, picking up on the issue of making sure that you have a diverse data set, you need to look broadly at the sources, right? Like we're talking about like EHRs and claims and registry But if you are getting if your main source of that information, and like we've talked about making sure that it's fit for purpose and that it's of high quality, but if it's at the same, no offense to Justin, academic medical centers where you're traditionally conducting clinical trials, you are likely going to get the same, type of population that would enroll in a clinical trial. And are we looking at sources more broadly, like from community hospitals? Are we looking at geographic diversity so that we can bring a more representative patient population into the fold of real world data sources? Are we also trying for inclusion? Like we've talked a lot about quality, right? But are we trying to find ways to include the data that may be more representative, even if we understand that there may be limitations in terms of, missingness or linkages or some of the concerns with real world data? Like, are we taking a broad view and saying, well, but this is really the best representation we have of other patient populations, which we normally wouldn't have. So can we recognize the limitations, but also see what we can learn from it? And I think finally, one thing we've sort of talked a lot about is like, there's a lot of guidance, but I do think that if the fit for purpose is not just to answer a question, but to achieve some regulatory, outcome or to be part of a specific decision, like we do need to dig into what those guidances say. And some of them are more operational around the issues we've discussed now about how to think about these quality concerns that FDA may have about the data, but some of them are like pure regulatory and sort of march through the regs and say, hey, here's our current framework and all the regs we look at when we're thinking about submissions for drug approval. And here's how we interpret that to apply to real world evidence. And the one I think, like I said, there's a lot of guidance and there's a framework, and FDA is doing a ton of work in this space, across products. But I think that the considerations for regulatory decision-making, that guidance, like if you're someone who lives and breathes in the Code of Federal Regulations and FDA approvals, like that's the one you should look at to see how they're taking all these other operational, guidances and positions and, thoughts that they've put out there and saying, okay, but like, here's the rules of the road and here's how we think it's going to apply in this circumstance where we are going to be looking at a regulatory decision. So you asked about collaborations. I think, you need to understand like where you might want to be at the end by walking back from the expectations there.
Yeah, Lauren, that's a great point. And, I think if you look across all the guidances that would potentially be relevant to RWE, one really consistent theme coming out of those guidances is that companies should consult with FDA early on in the process, right? When they're considering use of RWE to make sure that, they understand the agency's expectations and are able to plan accordingly. So with that, let's turn to a discussion about opportunities for use of RWE. And in some sense, I feel like everything we've been talking about, is relevant to future opportunities. When we're thinking about opportunities for RWE, at what stage of the product life cycle should we be focusing on? Lauren, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like we're working on, clinical trial design, targets, like really, really early. It's also, there's a lot of talk about AI in drug development. That's informed by RWE, also by, huge data sets looking at, what has been tried before and how different populations have been categorized in terms of feeding into a clinical trial. So I think that a lot of the initial conversation about RWE was sort of like we talked, I think Chris said, we talked about safety and, surveillance. And then we talked about earlier in terms of, helping get through, the regulatory process or better understanding of a product once it's in the real world and, payers have needs for it. But I think really early on, it can be, extremely helpful in, preserving R&D dollars to where they are, most likely to make an impact further down the line for patients.
Thanks, Lauren. And Chris, when we're thinking about RWE, do you have additional thoughts on how it can be used to enhance patient outcomes? I know you touched on patient centricity and other issues earlier, but would love to hear more from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked about informing sort of clinical practice guidelines, which is one thing, and that's probably one of the original ways. I mean, I used to work at the American Heart Association back in the day, and we were building these patient registries to do just that, to inform many of the clinical practice guidelines that are there. We talked about the post-marketing surveillance, which is another sort of initial sort of use case for RWE. But I think what you're seeing the world pivot to is a few things. There's a greater interest in personalized medicine, there's a greater interest in value, right? And so not only are we particularly interested, and value is sort of a very sort of broad term. You know, I think most people would automatically link it to economic, which economic is a key driver of it. But there's an overall societal benefit, right? Or humanistic value. I mean, and the question I was asked folks is, can you place a societal value on the development of the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, right? I mean, it's sort of reignited the entire world, right? And I don't know if you can necessarily place a value on that. We've tried to place an economic value on it, but it's difficult, right? So I think that as we continue to do, as the sort of cost effectiveness of a therapy becomes as important as the sort of clinical benefit of a therapy, I think that you'll see much more of that factored in. We're seeing that right now, where you know, there's you know, the treatment of we'll say biosimilars, for example, as an alternative to biologics, as one of the things, right? And I think that RWE can play a very critical role in understanding what the sort of what we don't know about biosimilars, because they just haven't been around long enough, right? And so we can understand essentially what those effectiveness of those therapies are as alternatives to biologics, which we know work and we know are safe. I think another piece of this too is supporting many of these sort of value-based care discussions. I don't think you've seen the sort of matriculation, if you will, of sort of these value-based or agreements and things of that nature, mostly because it's very difficult to sort of quantify, and it's definitely it's difficult also to agree on what you actually should be measuring when it comes to the effectiveness of these therapies in the real world context. So I think alignment there would be helpful. I think I mean, we talked about policy and we talked about comparative effectiveness research. We talked about identifying unmet needs, which is obviously critically important. And most people don't understand, like, the core business model of a pharmaceutical company is to answer a few questions, right? Number one is, what's the unmet need? Two, what's the current standard of care? Three, what are the therapies that are on market or already out there to treat according to that standard of care? And the last question is, well, what's the product differentiation, or what does our product do that's differently than what's already there, right? And I think fundamentally that doesn't change, whether it's an RCT, whether it's RWE, or whatever it is. And I think that we will always seek to better understand those, to answer those four questions using RWE.
Yeah, great point, Chris. And obviously this discussion, I think, is focused primarily on use of real world evidence for purposes of regulatory submission, right? But there's also, you know, I think growing adoption of use of real world evidence with payers and in promotion for drugs and devices and so on. So that's another area to watch. Any additional thoughts about opportunities before we move on to a discussion about what's on the horizon? Okay, so let's talk about what's to come.
I will say this,
Chris, go ahead.
One of the things that we've been exploring a lot right now, and I know that Lauren mentioned external comparators and external controls earlier. That's one area that we are particularly focused on, that use in many of our studies, but also this idea of drug repurposing, right? This is where you take an existing therapy or a therapy that never may have hit the market, and you find if there's other indications or other therapeutic areas where that drug can be used. And if you think about it, when we were trying to discover any sort of vaccine or treatment for COVID-19, that's exactly the first thing that all the pharmaceutical companies did. They said, what do we have in the vault, if you will, that potentially may be able to treat or vaccinate people against this particular disease? And what that spawns is this whole concept of drug repurposing and thinking about all the different rare diseases that we have out there that potentially can be treated with these therapies, the more we know about patient genetics. And so I think that one is probably one of the biggest ones to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I certainly think the pandemic has highlighted for us, you know, how valuable RWE can be. So let's now round out the discussion and talk about what's on the horizon. So Justin, starting with you, how do you think the next generation of data scientists is being trained to understand and to work with RWE?
Yeah, that's a really great, exciting question. And I'll say at first I was thinking, I was gonna push back on this data scientist, title, because I think, it's not just data scientist, but when I think about RWE and I think about training people to work with RWE, and we think about the whole pipeline, I think of data science as sort of the pipeline, everything from ingesting data to sort of creating results. And I think you kind of need all of these skills as part of a team to do. Like, no one person can really do RWE. You can't just you need a team. You need data engineers. You need data scientists. You need statisticians, and you need clinicians. You need patient advocacy groups. You need community participants. You need a whole team. And what we at Northeastern we really thought, and Chris sort of mentioned this lack of talent, and expertise, because this field, well, it didn't pop up overnight or yesterday. It sort of started in 2007. It hasn't really been addressed, I think, adequately in academia, in trainings. For instance, I think even, I haven't checked recently, but I usually check that. I don't think there's a textbook yet called Real World Evidence, which I did have to look for a while ago when we were establishing at Northeastern. We established our master's in real world evidence. And I think we're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate at Northeastern that the leadership at Northeastern really sees real world evidence and real world data. They see the value that these tools and techniques have to really have impact in people's lives, in real people's lives, to really affect patient outcomes and clinical decision making. And we are putting a real effort into establishing a way to train the next generation of people who are working with real world data to generate real world evidence. And so, we, and Lauren, I don't take any offense to what you said, because we don't have an academic medical center at Northeastern, which we are very fortunate for. So we work with all sorts of other hospital systems so we are in the process of acquiring large data assets. We have an EHR system that we've acquired from a data vendor. We're working with hospital systems in Maine with our Portland campus. So we are trying to get real world data assets that we can train our students on, because we want them, when they're on the market and they graduate and Chris hires them, we want them to be ready to start doing work for Chris on day one. And that's our goal. And so we really designed this study from the ground up, because for real world evidence, you need biostatistics, you need ethics, you need epidemiology, you need to be proficient in Python or R. You need these tool sets, and there's no really one course or existing courses that really address this. So we designed this program from the ground up, and in this sort of interesting modular and stackable way. We really want to build this out as an offering that we can work with companies that want to upskill their employees. For there's a lot of employees that we talk to at these pharmaceutical companies that want to learn these skills, that want to transition from one role, and they're seeing all this excitement around real world data, real world evidence, and we want to be there to sort of help train them. And then one other really interesting thing is we're also involved in helping societies run some real world evidence studies. So it's interesting timing. In about 2 hours, I'm going to hop on a plane and I'm going to go to Norway, where there's a meeting of orthopedic surgeons, clinicians. And for one of the pre-conference workshops, we've established, I think, 8 or 9 of them from all different countries have agreed upon a study protocol. They have already or are about to run the protocol on their data. We'll come together at this pre-conference workshop, and we are going to complete a study, hopefully in one day. I don't know if it'll happen, but that's the goal. And that's part of our, training clinicians to understand the power that they have of real world data, and sort of what they need and what teams they need in order to make this happen. So I think it's really exciting. I think students are really interested in it, and certainly we're seeing a lot of demand from employers. So those things go hand in hand, and really fortunate that Northeastern is really willing to make large investments. As I said, these data assets are not cheap, and we are making investments so that we can have our students have real experience working with this. So that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Justin. So Chris, it sounds like Justin's going to be sending some graduates your way. And I'd love to hear from you, Chris, about the therapeutic areas where you think RWE may have the biggest impact, both short-term and long-term.
Well, I mean, I know we talked about rare diseases and the sheer number of rare diseases, right? And arguably, if you start to really unpack this whole idea of personalized medicine to treat, it almost makes everything a rare disease, especially if you start looking at different, one of the areas is like oncology, for example, tumor type, tumor location, your genetic makeup, all these things sort of factor into that sort of progression of that disease for you, right? And arguably that could be considered it to be a rare disease. And so I think that oncology is certainly one of them. I think that another one that I would think, well, outside of infectious disease, which we talked a lot about COVID-19. So infectious diseases is certainly another huge area. I talked about the potential for biosimilars and their understanding their real world, because you'll see greater use of biosimilars in the real world. And I think those should be factored in. I also think that one of the areas that I'm particularly passionate about, and I think that you got a lot of opportunities in neurosciences and those sort of progressive diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, for example. And, and as you start to really design studies, you really want to start to really understand the treatment effect on the patient. And we're almost using like digital technologies to assess tremors, to assess sleep, to assess mobility, falls, all these different things that, would ultimately be evidence that we would use that probably would go on label for those different disease types. So I think neurological conditions are a ripe opportunity for expanded use of RWE too.
Thanks, Chris. And Lauren, let's talk about what's on the horizon from a regulatory perspective or other kind of policy or legal developments that you might be aware of.
I think that, from a practical perspective, FDA is going to have to deal more and more with multimodal data that, constitutes real world evidence, that it's not just from one source, but it's sources that will combine imaging and wearables and EHR data. And so like you're looking at it, more broadly. And so I think that in light of like their current guidance trajectory, I think that may present some like just practical regulatory challenges, because it doesn't seem to be totally conceptualized that is what they might be seeing, because they'll talk about concerns with EHR's own guidance and concerns with claims and, as you're going source by source, but really it can be from these sources combined for a single patient to get a better understanding of what it is you're trying to study. So that's one of the things that I think like practically there'll be a push to see that addressed more formally. And then I think that it really is going to be about the real world data that is informing AI, across, drug development and, other types of product development, because that's just going to be such a major source and driver of the initial algorithms that are developed, which can be, validated prospectively, but they will be developed, on retrospective data sets. And what do we think about data quality for those purposes, right? Because for AI, you might be you might be saying, okay, we recognize there are certain limitations by the inputs in the data, but we can improve over time as the, algorithm is deployed in more real world settings. So there's more of a chance to, fine tune or obtain better performance if you recognize the initial limitations on the data that have informed your development.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks to the panelists. At this point, we want to open it up to audience Q&A. So for those who are attending, you can feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It looks like we have one question that's come in so far. The question, have you seen anyone successfully seek pediatric exclusivity for rare disease drugs using RWE? It's a very specific question.
I mean, I haven't seen it, but I saw the question, and I will say that pediatric rare diseases, which is a little different, is one of the most promising areas of RWE because you're just so limited in the other opportunities to collect data, because traditionally, it's harder to enroll in a big clinical trial. So I haven't, seen it in this scenario, but I think it could be informative, and, could be used for a pediatric study in a rare disease is how I would interpret the question. You could use RWE in that setting, but I can't think of a specific exclusivity example.
Yeah, I can't think of one either, Lauren, but I was thinking earlier when we were talking about opportunities, I think that's, a great opportunity to leverage RWE in the future. Any other questions from our audience members? Okay, so in the last few minutes before I turn it back over to Bill and Fran, I thought we would do a quick lightning round. So go around the Zoom, and if each of the panelists could just spend a minute or so talking about, what they think the key takeaway is with respect to RWE, or maybe it's an issue that you're really excited about in the near term with RWE. It's really up to you, but just final thoughts from the panelists. Justin, we'll start with you.
Thank you. And thank you again for inviting me. It was really great to have this conversation, really great to meet Chris and Lauren and you, Kelly. I think maybe what I'm most excited about for RWE is the continued utility and just the value people are putting on proper data analysis, proper statistical analysis of these large data assets. And I really appreciate that both Chris and Lauren are coming at this with very thoughtful considerations to appropriate, proper, ethical use of these types of data and how the data then get used. And I think it's really when we think about big data and we think about all of a sudden getting access to these huge data sets and having these new AI tools and it's really easy to sort of lose the forest for the trees, I guess, and just sort of start digging in and start trying to, mash the numbers and see what kind of you can come up with in the data and what fancy new algorithms you can run to get, interesting new results. And I think, it's really important that we are mindful and that we, have proper guidelines to conducting these studies. We're involving appropriate stakeholders, and that we're educating the next generation in an appropriate way. That this is all part of the whole study plan from start to finish. And I think it's really good to sort of hear that is a general theme. I think that definitely came up a few times. Is this really appropriate, ethical, proper use of the data, and sort of as people one way or another are giving their data to us to use, and we are custodians of that data, and it's up to us and to make it worth it. And especially we think about rare diseases, and we think about this people are doing this because they are wanting improvements of their outcomes, of their treatment options, and we have to always sort of be grounded by that. So I'm really appreciate the comments of my co-panelists today.
Thanks, Justin. And now I'll turn to you, Lauren.
So I'm going to go back to my background as like a regulatory lawyer. And I think probably everyone on this call and everyone listening has seen various versions of those slides where you have like IND and, NDA, and then you have labeling and promotion and payment and new indications and sort of this total product life cycle and all the buckets that you fit into as you're bringing a product through FDA and hoping to get it paid for and dealing with various post-market issues, but also, looking for new indications, perhaps pediatric exclusivity, and that we see RWE just as all parts of this, as part of the normal discourse of when we're talking about the overall regulatory infrastructure for medical products, that it's just not a different program and a thing that has its own suite of guidances, but that it's part of everything you do in this field.
Thanks, Lauren. And finally, you, Chris.
No, I think it's a great question. I mean, one of the if you think about, oh, well, the question is what excites me most, and I think it's the opportunity to accelerate drug development. Let me just be clear about that. But the reason is because if you think about some of the greatest hindrances to getting drugs to market or getting drugs to patients in the fastest way possible, a lot of it has to do with sort of trial delays, recruitment challenges, now even not having representative populations in your studies, a lot of these things. And if you start to think about it, those are all things that RWE addresses, right? Whether it's an issue around how to inform much more recruitment efforts, whether we're targeting patients in specific geographics and geographies, or we're thinking about unconventional ways of partnering with sort of not traditionally we sort of partner with the academic medical centers on the coast, right, to do many of these studies. I think shifting away from that and being enabling an opportunity for to run trials or run studies in community hospitals is ripe for opportunity, and it sort of creates a deeper understanding of how these therapies really work with these populations. And it's, for me, increases access, right? Which is one of the more critically important things. So I think what excites me more at the heart of it all is the ability to accelerate drug development so that we can get therapies to patients faster than we ever did before.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to all of our panelists. It's been a fabulous conversation today. I've learned a lot from all of you and have appreciated the different perspectives and the backgrounds that you've been bringing to the topics. With that, I will turn it over first to Bill to close out the session.
Great, terrific, Kelly. What a wonderful job moderating, and thank you to Justin and Lauren and Chris for their insightful comments. I heard a number of consistent themes across the conversation. One, strategic partnerships are going to be important, and I think Chris said 85% of the drug companies had established partnerships with data firms of one kind or another. Secondly, that the application of RWE runs the gamut from early stage research and development to, as Chris put it, repurposing of existing drugs. And thirdly, that the talent issue is critical. Universities need to be part of the strategic partnerships, and programs like Northeastern's are going to play a very important role. And finally, there's a continuing standards issue. If we're going to use large-scale data sets, and particularly federated data sets that were referred to involving data from multiple sources, we need common standards. And those need to be developed not just by the government, but obviously in conjunction with academia and industry. So a terrific and exciting topic, and much more to come on it. And thank you again to Ropes for organizing this. Fran?
Thanks, Bill. And thanks so much to Kelly and your entire panel for a wonderful presentation. It was really so interesting to hear more about the various ways that data is gathered and used to measure effectiveness of different therapies, drugs, and devices. I just want to remind everyone quickly before we go that this is the third but not the final edition in our 2023 series for Data Insights. We have had a wonderful series this year. All of our webinars, including our previous webinars from this year, are available on the Ropes and Gray website. And whenever you RSVP to our webinars, you will receive a link to the recording for the webinar. So we have one more lined up for November, and we saved for last this year what might be the one topic everyone wants to talk about in data this year, which is AI. And in particular, the November panel will be looking at the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace, where employers and job seekers alike are using AI for recruiting, job seeking, and work-related tasks. Our November webinar will focus on the applications of AI tools in the labor and employment context, but also risks like bias and discrimination, copyright infringement, and privacy violations. It should be a really good panel. It's going to be led by Ropes and Gray partners Stephanie Bruce and Richard Kidd, and I encourage everyone to RSVP and come to that panel later in November. So thank you all for joining us today.